surf excel නම් භාගයයි මාසයකට වඩා රිදි සෝතයි.
Tonight, safe for the moment. With Afghanistan under imminent threat of reaching a political point of no return, the Foreign Secretary says Sri Lankan repatriation's not an issue.
Already 3 people have been taken to UK and 5 people taken to Qatar.
Musical chairs. President Gotabaya Rajapaksa shuffles 7 key ministries, with 6 ministers exchanging places. Danger signs. The Sri Lanka Medical Association says right now infrastructure alone isn't the solution.
We don't believe that increasing the resources would be the solution for this. We just have to reduce the number of cases.
As the National Hospital says, its oxygen and bed situation is stable at present.
But then there is a limit, so if there is a huge influx of patients, we will certainly struggle.
Accepting responsibility. The Malaysian Prime Minister's resignation is accepted by the country's monarch for his inability to form a government. All that and much more coming up on First at 9. This Monday, the 16th of August, 2021.
ඒ කියන්නේ ලයිෆ් බෝයි අවස්ථා 10කදී ලෙඩ රෝග 10කට හේතු වන වෛරස් ඇතුළු විෂ පිෂවලට එරෙහිව සටන් කරනවා කියලා.
From AdaDerana, this is AdaDerana First at 9. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
Good evening, welcome to First at 9. I'm Dhamke Kanai. Now then, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa reordered several cabinet ministries today in a shuffle that saw key portfolios such as health and education getting new heads. With that, former Foreign Minister Dinesh Gunawardena has been appointed as the country's education minister, while former education minister Professor G.L. Pires has taken over the foreign ministry. In addition, former Minister of Mass Media Keheliya Rambukwella has been given the Ministry of Health, while former Health Minister Pavitra Devi Wanyarachchi has been given the Transport Ministry.
A total of 7 key cabinet ministries were shuffled around today by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. Accordingly, the swearing-in of the ministers took place at the Presidential Secretariat this morning. The shuffle includes major ministries dealing with key issues in the country, namely health and education. With that, former Media Minister Keheliya Rambukwella has now been tasked with overseeing the country's COVID-19 efforts at a time when the country faces an uphill struggle to rein in rising cases and deaths. Former Health Minister Pavitra Devi Wanyarachchi, meanwhile, has been given the Ministry of Transport. Further, Ministers Professor G.L. Pires and Dinesh Gunawardena have switched places. Accordingly, Professor G.L. Pires will now spearhead Sri Lanka's engagement with the international community as the new Minister of Foreign Affairs. His predecessor Dinesh Gunawardena will now try his hand at solving the country's education crisis as teachers and principals continue to stay away from online lessons as they seek a solution to the more than 2-decade-long salary anomaly issue. In addition, former Minister of Energy Dallas Ala Peruma took oaths as the new Minister of Mass Media. Further, former Transport Minister Gamini Lokuge was appointed the new Minister of Energy. In the meantime, Sports and Youth Affairs Minister Namal Rajapaksa has been given an additional portfolio, that of development planning and monitoring.
Now, to shift the focus towards the pandemic situation, health experts believe that increasing healthcare infrastructure facilities to treat COVID patients is not the way to go, but reducing the daily caseload is. The Sri Lanka Medical Association voiced the concerns as the daily deaths increased from week to week. Last week's COVID deaths were 60% increase from the week before, and last week's new infections increase is 35% from the week before. In the meantime, Sri Lanka took delivery of 100,000 doses of the Pfizer vaccine today as the authorities look to immunize the country's eligible population in a race against time.
With Sri Lanka's daily cases having stayed at over 1,000 for the past 3 months, infections right now have tripled to over 3,000 for the past 4 days. This has placed immense pressure on hospital services that are fast reaching tipping point. Right now, fears are now rising that the health system would face the same fate as India's did earlier this year, with some major hospitals having already faced difficulties in providing some basic patient requirements such as beds.
It had come to a situation where if you contract the disease and if you become seriously ill, it does not look that there is a place available in hospital to accommodate any of the serious patients.
Right now, we are managing to deliver the oxygen needs of our patients. If you take NHSL, we have a large oxygen tank, I think the largest in the country. So that is supplying the oxygen needs of the patients at the moment. But then all resources are finite. I cannot stretch ourselves beyond limits. If the cases go up, then 5 to 10% maybe will require oxygen and advanced therapy. So those patients will overload the system. And the other particular thing about COVID-19 is that when patients are in ICUs or in high dependency units, they require prolonged period of stay there, maybe even 1 or 2 weeks or more. So the problem is when the system gets flooded, it's very difficult to discharge these patients home as well. At the moment, we are managing all right with the oxygen supplies, but then there is a limit. So if there is a huge influx of patients, we will certainly struggle.
With the situation currently as it stands, pressure has also been placed on health sector's tracking and tracing program of patients and their contacts as well. With this being the case, questions were posed to the Sri Lanka Medical Council as to whether retired health staff would be recalled to shore up manpower requirements.
If there's a need that the government would discuss and decide. More than that, it's the facilities, the oxygen, availability of beds and that type of facilities, and in addition to the nursing staff also is an issue. We just don't believe much that increasing the resources would be the solution for this. We just have to reduce the number of cases.
Meanwhile, with the recent move to treat asymptomatic patients with no pre-existing conditions at home was announced last month, there have been some hiccups in the process, with some patients citing difficulties in the registration process with local medical officers of health. Speaking on the matter, Director of the Health Promotion Bureau Dr. Ranjit Batuwantudava urged patients that in such cases to bear with the health sector staff as they deal with the mass influx of patients.
නිවසේ රඳවා බලා කියා ගන්නා රෝගීන්ට ලියාපදිංචි වීමට ක්‍රමයක් තියෙනවා. අපිට පෙනියන්නේ ඔබ ගොඩක් දිනෙකට මෙම ලියාපදිංචි වීම ඉතා ඉක්මනින් සිදු වී නොමැති බවයි. මේ සඳහා බලපාන හේතු කිහිපයක් තියෙනවා. එකක් තමයි මෙම ඔබගේ සෞඛ්‍ය වෛද්‍ය නිලධාරී කාර්යාලයේ නිලධාරීන් විශාල රෝගීන් සංඛ්‍යාවක් කළමනාකරණය කරමින් සිටින බැවින් දුරකථන පහසුකම් වල යම් අඩුලුහුණුකම් නිසා මෙවැනි තත්ත්වයක් ඇති විය හැකි බවයි. ඔබට පරීක්ෂණය පොසිටිව් වෙලා රෝග ලක්ෂණ නොමැති නම් මද රෝග ලක්ෂණ පමණක් නම් තිබෙන්නේ ලියාපදිංචි වෙනතුරු ඔබගේ රෝගය පිළිබඳ කල්පනාවෙන් සිටින්න. යම් අවස්ථාවක හෝ ඔබගේ රෝගය දරුණු අතට හැරෙනවා නම් හෝ හතිගතිය ඇති වෙනවා නම් ලියාපදිංචි වුවත් නැතත් වහාම ඔබව ළඟම රෝහලට ඇතුළත් කරගන්නවා ඇති.
In the meantime, President of the Sri Lanka Medical Association, Dr. Padma Gunaratna, also presented statistics on the country's growing caseload and death, and urged the public to not take the situation lightly, to be mindful of the present reality and the possible outcomes in the coming weeks.
The infection is rapidly rising, and according to the data that was given by the Ministry of Health, over last week there had been 24,000 reported cases of COVID. When compared to the one before the week, this had been a 34% rise of the number of cases, and when the Ministry of Health data is on a particular number of cases, we know that in the community there are about 3 times more than the number that is mentioned in the data. And then with regard to deaths also, there had been 918 deaths over last week, and that had been 60% more than the week before that. So based on this data, general public be able to assume how the number of cases and the deaths would be over next week and the one after.
Dr. Batuwantudava also touched on the issue of data accuracy of information released by the Ministry of Health and the Epidemiology Unit, saying that a lack of trust has risen among the public by this. He, however, added that there is no intentional attempt to conceal information from the public.
දත්ත හංගනවා කියන එක නම් කිසිසේත්ම එකග වෙන්න බෑ. වසංගත රෝග විද්‍යාංශය පැත්තෙන් බැලුවත් රෝගීන් සංඛ්‍යාව වැඩි වෙන එක යම්කිසි වැදගත්කමක් තියෙනවා. මොකද හැම වෙලේම කියනවානේ මේ ලංකාවේ මරණ ප්‍රමාණය වැඩි, මරණ අනුපාතය වැඩි, ඇයි මේ කියලා අහනවානේ. ඒකට හොඳ පිළිතුරක් ලබා දෙන්න පුළුවන් මේ වාර්තා නොවුණු සියලුම රෝගීන් පද්ධතියට එකතු කරගෙන වාර්තාවට එකතු වුණාම. ඒදී අපි දන්නවා මේ මරණ අනුපාතය ගණන් ගන්න එක් සාධකයක් තමයි මුළු රෝගීන් සංඛ්‍යාව. මුළු රෝගීන් සංඛ්‍යාව වැඩිවීම මරණ අනුපාතිකය අඩු වෙනවා එතකොට ඔටෝමැටිකලි. මේ වැරද්ද නිවැරදි කරගත් විට අපේ රටේ කොවිඩ් රෝගීන් පිළිබඳ මරණ අනුපාතිකය පල්ලෙහාට ඇවිල්ලා නිවැරදි අගයට පැමිණෙන බව තමයි මම විශ්වාස කරන්නේ.
Meanwhile, since the onset of the pandemic, those belonging to high-risk groups have been urged to take extra precautions, curtail unnecessary public interaction, and get vaccinated. One such group are expectant mothers.
ගර්භණී මව්වරුන්ට දෙන්න මේ දක්වා අපි ලංකාවේ අනුමත කළ තිබුණේ සයිනෝෆාම් වෙනත පමණයි. නමුත් පහුගිය සිකුරාදා ඒ පිළිබඳ උපදේශන කමිටුවෙන් අනුමැතිය ලැබුණා අනිත් එන්නත් වර්ග තුනටම. ඒ කියන්නේ ස්පුට්නික් V එන්නත හැර අනිත් සියලුම එන්නත් වලට මේ වන විට ගර්භණී කාලයේදී ලබා දීමට අනුමැතිය ලැබිලා තියෙනවා. ඒ වගේම ගර්භණී කාලයේ මුල් සති 12 එන්නත ලබා ගැනීමෙන් වැළැක්විය සිටිය යුතු නැහැ. ඔබට ගර්භණී සමයේ ඕනම අවස්ථාවක ඒ සිකත සඳහන් කරන වර්ග 4න් ඕනම එකක් ලබා ගැනීමට හැකියාව තියෙනවා.
However, officials urge expectant mothers to also ensure they don't contract the virus because of serious complications that could affect their unborn children.
ගර්භණී මවට පමණක් නෙමෙයි කුස තුල සිටින දරුවාටත් සංකූලතා ඇති වෙන්න පුළුවන්. ප්‍රධාන වශයෙන්ම කියනවා නම් ගර්භණී මවක් මේ කොවිඩ් ආසාදිත වුණාට පස්සේ කුස තුල සිටින දරුවා નિયમિત දිනට කලින් බිහිවීමේ අවදානමක් තියෙනවා. ඒ වගේම මව් කුස තුල දරුවා මිය යාමට පවා අවදානමක් තියෙනවා. ඒ වගේම નિયમિત දිනයට කලින් බිහිවන දරුවන්ට එතකොට මොළේ වර්ධනයේ අඩුකම, පෙනහළු වල වර්ධනයේ අඩුකම වගේ දේවල් නිසා ඇතිවන සංකූල. ඒ නිසා
In other developments, the country's overall COVID recoveries rose by 2,325 today to 312,000. As for today's COVID-19 infections, 2,428 new cases have been confirmed so far.
අඩසේ වසකට වැඩි ජනතා විශ්වාසය නව සංයෝගයකින් රයිනෝ රෝෆිං සහ සීලිං ෂීට්.
පත අට එකට මුසුකොට හෙළදිව් අට මුසු.
Now then, Afghanistan's Taliban movement announced that the war is over as it is poised to take control of the beleaguered country for the first time in 20 years following its invasion of US and allied forces after 9/11. With Taliban insurgents having completely encircled the capital Kabul since the weekend, the country's president, Ashraf Ghani, fled the country to Tajikistan yesterday, leaving the country at the mercy of the group. With over 60 Sri Lankans reportedly in the country and as other nations rush to evacuate their citizens and diplomatic staff, the question of their safety was posed to Foreign Secretary Admiral Professor Janat Colombo today. He revealed that the Taliban has assured the safety of foreign nationals and that the wheels are already in motion to repatriate them if necessary. It has been 20 years since the US forces entered Afghanistan under the popular banner at the time, War on Terror, at the heels of the 9/11 attacks perpetrated by the Al-Qaeda. In that time, $1 trillion has been spent by the US, which includes training of Afghan forces. But with the election of Donald Trump to the United States top office, a deal was struck with the Taliban to withdraw the US troops from the country, as long as the conditions in the deal were met by the Taliban. Then, with the new administration of Joe Biden coming to power, it decided to continue with the troops' withdrawal, with the deadline set for the 31st of August. But it then decided to complete the full withdrawal by the 11th of September this year. As the US government began scaling back the troops in May this year, the Taliban saw an opportunity and launched a major offensive. Towns and cities were overrun and their control seized. The onslaught kept gathering momentum, and on last Friday, the Afghan government stronghold Kandahar, the second largest city in the country, fell into the clutches of the terrorist group. At that point, the Pentagon did not consider there to be an imminent threat to the country's capital Kabul, but insinuated that there wasn't much resistance against the advancing Taliban fighters.
We have been watching this from a very early period, right after the president gave us the order to draw down, and we have noted with great concern the speed with which they have been moving and the lack of resistance that they have faced. And we have been nothing but honest about that, and I think I'll leave it there. Kabul is not right now in an imminent threat environment. But clearly, if you just look at what the Taliban's been doing, you can see that they are trying to isolate Kabul. What they want to do, if they achieve that isolation, I think only they can speak to. But you can see a certain effort to isolate Kabul.
Fast forward 2 days and Kabul has fallen, plunging the fate of the country and the people there into uncertainty. Afghan President Ashraf Ghani also fled the country, leaving his people leaderless. As the news broke, the Sri Lankan government too was concerned for the safety of its own citizens living in Afghanistan. Speaking to First at 9, Foreign Secretary Admiral Professor Jayanath Kolambage insisted that there isn't panic among Sri Lankans there, at least for the time being, and have sought assistance from other nations to evacuate Sri Lankans if the need arises.
From what we know, there is no imminent danger to any Sri Lankans or for that matter any foreigners in Afghanistan, because the Taliban has made a pledge that they will not harm any foreigners and they would allow the foreigners to leave if they decide to do so. So we are in touch with the Sri Lankan community living and working in Afghanistan. As of now, we have about 61 names and already 3 people have been taken to UK and 5 people taken to Qatar. So we have requested countries like USA, UK, India, Pakistan to help evacuate Sri Lankans to some kind of safety before they can actually reach Sri Lanka. This is the request that we have made and we are awaiting. But unfortunately, the situation in Kabul International Airport is very chaotic. We have seen the pictures of large number of people on the tarmac trying to climb onto any plane. So therefore, the Kabul International Airport is closed. No plane can land, no plane can take off in this situation. So that may really delay evacuating our people, but we are hopeful that we can get the Sri Lankans back to Sri Lanka and out of Afghanistan if they desire to do so.
The ground situation in Afghanistan is both desperation and panic. Thousands of Afghan nationals have gathered at the Hamid Karzai International Airport with the intention of fleeing the country. Afraid of their fate at the hands of the brutal Taliban, they attempted to board planes set for departure, with many even hanging onto the door as if they are buses. Many of them don't particularly care where they go, as long as it's away from Afghanistan and the clutches of the Taliban. As for the prospect of Sri Lanka stepping in to help these people by providing asylum, the Foreign Secretary says the matter is yet to be discussed and there is no official stance on the matter just yet.
So this is an issue that the government has not discussed. So we need to bring this up maybe in the Security Council or maybe with His Excellency the President and with the new Foreign Minister coming to take over the job today, that we need to be very carefully studying this. How many are willing to come, and if we accept them, how are we going to look after them? For how long we have to look after them? We have to be very mindful that we are still grappling with the COVID-19 situation. So we don't want to aggravate that situation because we are trying our best to overcome. So it is too early to say whether government of Sri Lanka is ready to take any Afghan nationals to give them sanctuary until they are accepted by a third country or until they are accepted by a country like America. We will have to monitor the evolving situation and get a directive from the political leadership, and then only we can give a word about accepting Afghan nationals into Sri Lanka.
Before capital Kabul fell last evening, several countries including the UK, the US, France, the UAE, Saudi Arabia and Nepal launched operations to repatriate their nationals in Afghanistan. The Taliban has now gained ground in 26 out of the 34 provincial capitals. While the Taliban was in the process of capturing Kabul, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken defended President Joe Biden's Afghanistan withdrawal yesterday, saying that the idea that waiting would have caused a better outcome was fiction.
We inherited a deadline negotiated by the previous administration. That deadline was May 1st. And the idea that we could have maintained the status quo beyond May 1st if the president had decided to stay, I think is a fiction. Here's what is likely to have happened had the president decided to do that. During the time from when the agreement was reached to May 1st, the Taliban had stopped attacking our forces, stopped attacking NATO forces. It had not sought to take over the entire country by going at these major provincial capitals. Come May 2nd, if the president had decided to stay, all gloves would have been off. We would have been back at war with the Taliban, attacking our forces. The offensive you've seen throughout the country almost certainly would have proceeded. We would have had about 2,500 forces in country with air power. That would not have been sufficient to deal with the situation. And I would be on your show right now explaining why we were sending tens of thousands of forces back into Afghanistan to restart a war that we need to end. I have to tell you that the inability of Afghan security forces to defend their country has played a very powerful role in what we've seen over the last few weeks. The fact is, we invested, the international community invested over 20 years, billions of dollars in these forces, 300,000 of them, with an air force, something the Taliban didn't have, with the most modern, sophisticated equipment. And unfortunately, tragically, they have not been able to defend the country. And I think that explains why this has moved as quickly as it's moved.
Further, the Taliban insurgency has left the regional security in the balance as countries closely monitor the developments with a keen eye to decide their next move. Afghanistan is a member of the SAARC bloc, as is Sri Lanka.
Sri Lanka is also monitoring, collecting various information from different sources in order to understand what is exactly happening in Afghanistan. Because this is a matter of great concern for the regional security. It is too early to say what we will do should there be a complete takeover of power by the Taliban, because the world response is awaited. I think we need to take a stance as the South Asian region. So we need to monitor what our neighbors, our friendly countries are doing, and then only we can make a decision how to deal with the situation in Afghanistan in the future. But right now, the entire world is monitoring, is watching the Afghanistan situation very closely.
We will see you on the other side of this break. Bear with us.
Big 3.
Welcome back. You're watching First at 9. Now, health authorities today addressed public doubts over the effectiveness of a 6-hour quarantine curfew that is set to come into effect in less than an hour from until 4 a.m. tomorrow. Director of the Health Promotion Bureau, Dr. Ranjit Batuantudawa, says that given the present situation, even the slightest measures can contribute in some way to the reduction of cases.
After quite some time, Sri Lanka will see an island-wide curfew. It will be effective from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. starting from tonight. Given the window of the curfew, questions were raised by some factions of the society over its effectiveness, doubting its intended impact. The answer from the authorities is that every little measure counts, even if the impact is minimal.
අප සතුව තියෙන සියලුම ආකාර භාවිතා කළ යුතුයි. පොඩි ඉම්පැක්ට් එකක් වුණත් මේ රාත්‍රී කාලේ දිනපතා නිරෝධායන ඇඳිරි නීතිය පැවැත්වීමෙන් රාත්‍රී කාලේ ගමන් බිමන් එහා මෙහා යාමත් මිනිසුන්ට ඉක්මනින් ගෙදර ගොස් තමා ආරක්ෂිතව සිටිය යුතු බවට හැඟීමක් ඇතිවීමත් මේ දිනපතා පැවැත්වෙන දෙයක් බැවින් රටේ යම්කිසි නිරෝධායනයේ විය යුතු තත්ත්වයක් ඇති බව නිතරම මතක් වීමටත් උර දෙනවා ඇති. ඊට අමතරව අපි දැකපු දෙයක් තමයි සාද පැවැත්වීම, තැන්වී කටයුතු කිරීම. මම හිතන්නේ අපි දන්නවා මේ ඩෙල්ටා ප්‍රභේදය පැතිරෙන අවස්ථාවක ඊටාම සුළු වෙලාවක් වුණත් ඇති තව කෙනෙකුට වෛරසය පැතිරීමට. ඉඳන් මම හිතනවා අපි මේ රාත්‍රී කාලේ නිරෝධායන නීතිය යෙදීම සාධනීය ලෙස බලන්නට ඕනේ.
In addition to these restrictions, all weddings and events that gather large crowds of people will not be allowed to take place from today. However, marriage registrations will be allowed with limited participants. Accordingly, only the bride, the groom, the parents of both parties, the marriage registrar and the 2 witnesses will be allowed at the registration. Meanwhile, the police say that people crossing borders for compassionate reasons are the only exception to the border crossing restrictions put in place other than essential service personnel.
If a person needs to go to the nearest hospital for treatment in an exigency situation, they can proceed to the nearest hospital without permission. But the members of essential services would move during this period, but sometimes the police officers would check their identity, the relevant documents, and whenever it is required, the members of the essential services should provide all necessary documents to prove that they are engaging in the duties of essential services.
In other local news, Senior Superintendent of Police Nihal Taldua has been appointed as the new police media spokesperson with effect from today. SSP Taldua takes over from Senior DIG Ajit Rohana, who has held the position on 4 separate occasions. SSP Taldua is an attorney at law and currently serves as the Director of the Police Media Division. He previously served as Director of the Terrorism Investigation Division as well as the head of the Western Province Intelligence Unit. He had also served as the Superintendent of Police for the Jaffna District. Welcome back. This is First at 9. Now, Fitch Ratings has issued a new report announcing that ratings of state banks, Bank of Ceylon and the People's Bank, will no longer be driven by the sovereign support but their intrinsic value only. The reason given by the ratings agency is that the sovereign's ability to provide strong support to the state banks has been constrained.
In its latest report, ratings agency Fitch Ratings says that the national ratings of Sri Lankan banks remain constrained by the country's sovereign credit profile. Fitch explains that under present conditions, it can only assess Sri Lankan bank viability ratings and rupee issuer default ratings on the international scale above the sovereign's local currency IDR rating and local bank operating environment ratings of CCC. This, the report says, is because of banks' direct exposure to the sovereign through government security holdings, the wider domestic economy and the financial markets in the country. It adds that such conditions mean that sovereign exposure would tend to be higher among the larger local banks. This, it says, is the reason for rating compression at AA- on the national scale. The report also reveals that it would no longer factor in extraordinary support for state banks, the Bank of Ceylon and People's Bank, regardless of their state linkages, as the sovereign's ability to provide strong support has been constrained. Fitch says that as a result, the two banks' national ratings are now driven by their intrinsic credit profiles alone and does not include sovereign support.
Now to take a look at the Colombo bourse, the Sri Lankan shares closed lower today as the financial and consumer discretionary stocks fell amid a rapid spread of the Delta variant in the country. Accordingly, the CSE All-Share Price Index ended 0.73% lower at 7,937.28 points after logging its third straight weekly loss on Friday. The S&P SL22 saw a drop of 13.60 points to end at 2,977.31. With that, here's Dimantha Matthew with a more detailed report on how the market fared today.
Today we saw the implementation of the DVP system in the market. This was a long due change that the overall market required and most of the large foreign investors were requesting for. We had a bit of a shorter trading session during the day. And with that we saw lower level of turnover also due to that. Just 834 million number of transactions were also onto the lower side with only about 11,000. The SPI declined to 7,934 points. We saw the turnover levels being dominated by the diversified financial segment and also the transportation segment. We saw a selected amount of capital goods counters also trading hands, and this segment are the ones that dominated the market during the day. However,
in the meantime, the rupee also continued to remain at the same rate as last week at 202.89 against the US dollar. Now let's take a look at how the Sri Lankan rupee fared against other major currencies during the day. The Malaysian king has accepted the resignation tendered by Prime Minister Muhyiddin Yassin and his cabinet. Sultan Abdullah also appointed Muhyiddin as the caretaker prime minister until his successor was chosen, the National Palace confirmed in a statement. In a televised address, Muhyiddin said he resigned as he had lost the majority support in the lower house of parliament. He explained that although he had initially sought to test his support in Parliament, the withdrawal of support by a dozen of MPs from his own coalition and the rejection of cross-party cooperation by the opposition had left him with no alternative. According to Malaysia's constitution, the king, as the country's supreme head of state, appoints a parliament member as the prime minister, whom in his view commands the majority of the parliamentarians. And that's it from all of us here at First at 9. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.